Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Lazar, and I am a newly minted associate professor. And I've been at the University of Maryland in College Park in the College of Information Studies with an affiliate appointment in the Department of Computer Science. My background is in biomedical and health informatics, and I am now mostly working in the field of human-computer interaction, which is all about technology design, user or human-centered design, developing methods to make sure that our technologies better include the perspectives of the end users. And what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of a critical reflection on some of the ways that we design, develop technologies for older adults. And I'm going to talk about ageism. So age stereotypes affect technology design, development, and adoption. They creep into every aspect of the work we do, designing technology for older adults, and also the experience of older people receiving them. So I argue that if we want to design effective technologies that will work for older adults, technologies that they'll want to use, we need to know about ageism. So we'll start with the definition. Ageism was defined by Butler, Robert Butler, a gerontologist and the first director of the National Institute on Aging. And he defined ageism or age discrimination as a process of systematic stereotyping and discrimination against people because they are old. Butler drew parallels to other forms of discrimination like racism and sexism. And this is useful because ageism also operates in complex ways. It affects the ways that we think, feel, and behave. And it works at different levels on the individual or micro level, at the social or meso level, and also at institutional and cultural levels or the macro level. So these parallels to other forms of discrimination are useful, but ageism also has some unique features. For one, people move from insider to outsider status as they age. If we're fortunate to live long enough, everyone will be older eventually. So it's really in our best interest to address ageism because it is making our own futures better. But it also means that unique kinds of distancing and interactions can occur with people of all ages trying to be as far as possible from the stigma associated with older age as possible. Ageism is also unique because it's a pretty socially acceptable form of bias, where it's not as recognized as some of the others. How harmful seemingly light or casual ageist comments or discussions are. For example, if you walk through a drugstore or a party shop, you'll see a lot of kind of commentary on older age as something that is something to be feared, that's dangerous. The idea that once you pass a certain age, as young as 40, we can see here, it's a negative thing. You're past your prime. We encounter this messaging in our day-to-day lives. At a recent optometrist visit, I was surprised when my intake form had me comment not only on any changes in my vision that I experienced, but also asked me to rate how I felt about how much I wanted to address fine lines around my eyes and other signs of aging that have no health significance but are treated clinically. So one way of looking at these, right, are kind of natural changes. And another way of looking at them are something to fight, to be feared. The term anti-aging that we see on many products is something I think, should pause and think about. So it's not just in casual places that we encounter this, right? We have laws in place to prevent age discrimination in the workplace, but we still see bias favoring younger candidates. We see people experiencing negative consequences like being denied promotions or laid off. And just like the rest of the population, healthcare providers can hold unconscious negative attitudes towards older adults. So the effects of ageism are seen all over healthcare as well. An example is when a treatable pathology is dismissed as a feature of older age. So instead of being treated, someone is told that this is just a part of getting older. In dementia, which is a topic that I do a lot of research on, this can look like a doctor speaking to someone normally one day, and as soon as they fail a screener for cognitive impairment or indicate, the screener indicates that they have a certain score that might indicate the possibility of dementia. All of a sudden, the doctor is only looking and talking to the caregiver. So this is my background about ageism, how it appears in everyday life, including some very impactful settings and more kind of mundane settings. But how does ageism affect technology adoption? So these examples, as the backdrop, we're going to dive into technology and where ageism or age stereotypes appear here. The first place that I'm going to talk about where ageism appears in technology design is probably the most well-studied topic in the literature so far. And this is the ways that some older people will reject technology that signifies it is for a frail elderly person, something that researchers have called this not for me phenomenon. So the idea is, if you've seen these life alert or the commercials, right, where I've fallen and I can't get up, that's become almost a cultural joke for some. And older people also have seen the commercials, and many do not want to be that helpless person on the floor who's fallen and can't get up. So the pendant itself becomes an object that signifies frailty or someone that you don't want to be. So you may not want to wear it, right? And we can see this as coming from internalized ageism, which is that micro level of how ageism operates, where older people have absorbed negative messaging about what it means to be a person in need of this kind of support. And they want to get as far away from that as possible. I'll give a more in-depth example from a really nice research paper. And this research paper is about a bigger picture about the socio-material arrangements that enable people to continue living independently. They talk about how the introduction of a new service, like an alarm service in this case, challenges people's existing arrangements and requires work to adjust. But part of the paper addresses how someone ended up using their alarm pendant. And this participant said, most of the time, I certainly do not wear it. One of my neighbors, who's pretty frail, wears it all the time, but I'm always going out and moving around up and down. Taking the pendant on and off constantly would be annoying, and I don't want to wear it when I'm out in the street. That's why the telecare pendant is usually hanging in the kitchen, where I spend most of the time. So this participant later acknowledged that that means she probably wouldn't be able to reach it in an emergency. But at the same time, this is what made sense for her. So I like this example because it illustrates how we can design the most effective, usable technology that meets a real need in a population, but it still might end up just hanging on someone's kitchen wall if it's not acceptable to them because of this. And for this, in this instance, we can see ageism kind of lurking in the background, this internalized ageism. Other examples of internalized ageism include when some older people self-stereotype about their own ability to use technology. So they assume that a new technology is something that they will be able to use because they're older and because they've internalized messaging associated with older age and technology use. At the social and organizational level, or the MESO level, we can also see examples of how ageism appears in technology design. So the tech industry, right, the people designing and developing the technologies we use is young. Ageism starts there even younger than it does in other industries. Some people talk about starting in their 30s, they're experiencing kind of age discrimination. Not only are people younger in the tech industry, but they may be not involving older people in their focus groups and things like that. And they may have ageist assumptions themselves, as does many of the population. So some of my favorite research studies are ones that follow around other researchers and look at kind of what assumptions they have. So this one I linked here is a study of AI developers who subscribe to a discourse of older people as passive, dependent, and inept. So of course, this is not to say that designers and developers are bad because they're holding these opinions. It's just that we all live in the same, in a culture where ageism is strong. So we've absorbed this messaging and it affects the way we work with people. Another way that ageism appears at the social and organizational level is where older adults can be perceived as digitally inferior or uninterested. So we saw the other side of that on the micro level, but it also occurs from others, of course. So this could look like older people not being offered technology-based treatments or assistive technologies because it's assumed that they won't be able to use it. And now we can talk about at this highest level, where does ageism appear in design and policy? Well, this has been examined. I'm going to talk about this specifically in the context of AI, where researchers have spoken about one, that older adults aren't included in technology research and design in the first place. But then we don't have enough data from them to train AI models. So they may not work as well on older people's speech, for example, or walking. They won't be able to detect, the models don't work for them the way it does for other populations. And then our data sets and our algorithms can have age-related bias. So for example, where we enter the word older person and something will spit out a more negative answer than it would if you entered the word, enter a question about younger people. So with this heavy picture, many researchers have arrived at this idea that user-centered design can help mitigate it, some of this age-related age bias. So user-centered design, also sometimes called human-centered design, is a process of iterative design cycles, all focused around the end user of the technology. This has been heralded as a way to address the age bias that we keep seeing appearing in technology. So this is outside of, inside, but also outside of academia. We're seeing people talking about user-centered design as the solution. Researchers, government organizations, and companies are all embracing this approach to make technologies more useful, accessible, and acceptable. For example, this paper, one of their solutions for ageism, digital ageism, is that individuals of all ages should have a say within the design of digital technology regarding style, type, and user-friendliness. And I agree with this. I think we do need to incorporate user-centered design. It helps us pivot when people tell us that something that we had originally kind of dreamed of isn't really the right direction for them. Helps us make things that'll better fit into people's lives. And it's great that more and more people are recognizing this. But is it really the complete solution to ageism as it appears in technology design and adoption? Can user-centered design eliminate ageism in this space? So unfortunately, not completely. And I'm going to tell you a couple of reasons why. So the first reason is that even when user-centered designers have the best intentions, work hard as they can to follow a user-centered design method, which is all about asking the end user what they want, what they need, challenging your own assumptions of what a different population wants. Stereotypes of aging get in the way. And this has been found in some of the study types that I've described, where researchers are following other researchers and seeing how they're engaging methods. So there's been one research study is it's ethnographers following around user-centered designers working in an older adult living community. And they find that these user-centered designers were talking to older adults, which is great, about the technology they're trying to design. But they kept on prioritizing caregivers' preferences over older adults, even when the caregiver said, hey, you should talk to the older people. So, okay, so one solution to this, right, is that we have a lot of work to do as user-centered designers to challenge our own ageism. That's really important. That's going to help get us to a certain place. But it still doesn't solve the problem, because older participants themselves may also be designing based on stereotypes of aging. That's where that internalized ageism comes into play. So we know that older adults are creative and have much to contribute to the design process, but there's a number of research studies that had kept finding the ways that older participants are designing for other people. For example, in the lower left study, these older people were engaged in design, and they kept talking about what might be good for their grandchildren. Other research studies show people designing for other older people frequently. So I'm not interested in this, but I think my older relative would have liked it. Um, and then in one notable study at the top, the researchers went through this really comprehensive user-centered design process where they had designed something based on all the steps you're supposed to take, making sure it's people's preferences, but the participants, the people who had designed these technologies ended up not wanting to use them while they were developed. So in one study, we attempted to try to understand this phenomena a little better. So we sought to answer the research questions of who do participants envision as a user of the technology that they're designing? And how do their attitudes towards technology impact their participation in design activities? And I'm going to be focusing a little more on this first one. So this can also be seen as a bit of a case study, right? We did it was with a small group of 6 older adult participants, but we did this multi-phase study and studied in depth their motivations for design and participation at every stage of the project. So I'm going to give you a little overview about the project so that we can understand what happened here, the context. So this our co-design process for Internet of Things technologies in the home involved first initial one-on-one interviews. In these interviews, we identified topics for the study based on what came up the most. We then conducted focus groups with participants, so all together, where they brainstormed scenarios of daily activities that were important and meaningful to them. And they individually could choose whether to focus on health or hobbies, those 2 topics that came up in those initial interviews. We had a take-home journal before the next workshop where people took Polaroid pictures of the objects in their home and answered other kinds of prompts to help prepare them to do the design activity in the design workshop. Also in the design workshop, we had taken findings from the focus groups. We had to work quickly here to design what-if scenarios around the topics that had come up. So there were 6 topics that came up for these scenarios: medication notifier, nudges for staying active and healthy, customized exercise. So again, you see these different kind of health topics coming up again and again in the focus group. During the design workshops, they selected scenarios and they designed technological solutions. And then finally, we did follow-up interviews to understand their experiences with the workshop and get any critical feedback they had for us. So in the focus group, right, that the stage right after the initial interviews, health and particularly medication reminders emerged as the topic of most interest amongst participants. Examples are P1, one participant asking other people if they took medication daily, and do you ever forget to take your medicine? So, right, trying to get at the scenario of medication notification. Another participant said, taking medication, remembering to take that medication, most of us probably have something we need to take. The third quote I have here is a participant saying, if we're going to design technology to help us with something, I think the priority would be those health issues. So these are pretty positive sentiments around designing for health and the importance of that topic, specifically medication reminders. But in people's take-home journals and in that second workshop, people brought up other needs. They talked about taking care of the house, customized exercise and organizing files and ideas, a sound system through the house, and monitoring vitals. So we do have still some health-related things popping up, right? Monitoring vitals, customized exercise, but the medication reminders really fell out. So now we can look back to kind of critically look at some of participant statements to understand what was happening here. And we conclude that participants went through this journey from stereotyping to designing for themselves. So in the first workshop, the discussion is centered on what older adults in general need. For example, while deciding whether to focus on health or hobbies, one participant said, generally, for older adults, health is the issue. This topic would be more in common, probably between all of us. So these attempts to ensure a common interest within the group led people to discuss the needs of a stereotypical older adult, and is probably what resulted in the topic of medication reminders as being that primary topic people decided to focus on. But when we conducted follow-up interviews, we found that that discussion had not reflected real needs for participants. Some agreed just to relate to others in the group. So in P6, who was actually the one who initiated the discussion of medication reminders in the workshop, told us in a follow-up interview that she wasn't very excited about it in the first place. She only thought it would be a good idea and useful because she took care of her elderly mother who had lots of medications. So here we're seeing that the discussion in the first workshop didn't really stem from personal interest, but more from participants trying to find a common ground to converge on, which led them to think about what would be appropriate for older adults as a population. But I did tell you about how in that second workshop, the design workshop, where they started to design technologies, they didn't go to medication reminders. Instead, they had a variety of uses that they were actually seemed to be interested in. For example, one participant said, for my house, I would want to have a bulletin board, especially the electrical wiring plumbing leak. I want one of those electronic bulletin boards like now, don't you? So talking about a smart and connected system that could be aware of different things in the house and know what's going on. So to understand how they got to these ideas, we think that having that take-home activity where they were able to sit in their own home and kind of check out what actually had to do with their needs, rather than trying to converge on something in common, is what helped them get there. So what does this study imply? That as researchers, listening closely to participants is not enough to evade stereotypes of aging, no matter how much we work on our own assumption. But it does give us some hints of how we might configure things differently to help reduce participants stereotyping themselves and others when working in these kind of common activities like focus groups and design workshops. One is having them have some kind of activity that embeds them in their context, right? Or the context in which they're designing for. Another suggestion is to consider having people work separately and aggregate their responses to support that divergent thinking and convergent. So lots more to be explored here. So we talked about how participants, we can start thinking of how to ameliorate some of the ways that people are designing based on stereotypes of aging. But even if we work through that, it's not just interactions between older participants in our research studies that have ageism against the backdrop, because people in our research studies are also managing our impressions, speaking as the researcher side. So here I'll just tell you briefly about one study that asked how older adults perform impression management in usability studies. So their motivation was saying, we actually know that all people in usability studies, where they're trying to understand whether the technology is easily usable, if the icons are in the right place, if the walkthrough makes sense, we know in general that people try to manage the impression of the researcher to give a certain sense of who they are and their capabilities. But they talk about literature that shows older people are more likely to do this. So the topics that they found that older individuals in their study were using included supplication, where you portray yourself as weak or dependent to get help. You ask lots of questions, and advertising competence in a particular area or about a particular issue. So this would involve attempts to involve the researcher in the test, even if the researcher demonstrated they're reluctant to engage, like asking, should I do this now? Is this what you want me to do? Another tactic is exemplification, which is where you behave in ways intended to make you seen as nice and polite. This could be acting like a model participant or working extra hard on something when the results will be seen by the researcher. And then they found blaming to be the most common impression management tactic used. It manifested in two ways. One, blaming the technology, and the other was blaming the researcher. So it's interesting to look into the different ways that they saw participants engaging in impression management. But what I want to point to here is the idea that we can design the most ideal study, just like we can design the most ideal technology, but we need to be aware of ageism lurking in the background in order to know how to interpret some of these results and mitigate it if possible. Okay, so these examples show us how ageism affects how we engage in user-centered design, which includes researchers regardless of their age, but also different older participants we work with. I described how it operates at each of the different levels of micro, meso, and macro, and also how user-centered design, while I think going in the right direction, does bring additional complexities given the pervasiveness of ageism. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do about this. So I do think understanding is the key first step. And we're fortunate that we have a large body of literature in gerontology, especially critical and social gerontology, as well as some research in science and technology studies that really delve into different kinds of discourses on aging that shape participation. So researchers can learn about and seek to challenge the ageist discourses that are likely to come up in our projects. Sometimes you can know this in advance, but sometimes you can only look at this once you get your data back. So as an example, in one study that I did when I was a young grad student, I went into the homes of older people and I asked them about their leisure activities. And I got answers, a lot of answers like the following, which puzzled me. So participants told me over and over again how busy they were, how much they had to do, how they barely had a second to stop. Like this participant who said, I'm never bored because I feel like there's always something to do, always. If I had a few minutes and I wasn't doing anything else, I'd work a puzzle or something to keep me occupied. And in the picture, you see someone working on a Sudoku puzzle while watching TV. So doing multiple activities at once, just trying to fill the day. And over time, as I was doing the analysis process, I came upon this idea of the busy ethic, which researchers have discussed as a moral requirement that older adults experience to, or kind of our pressure to, as we often say, right, use it or lose it. So this idea of using our physical and cognitive abilities so we don't lose them, and that's something important, and we all can agree on that. But it's also experienced as this tremendous amount of pressure. And it's likely that me coming in there and asking about them about their leisure activities and even calling them leisure activities may have kind of triggered the need to express that they were living like an older adult should, right? So in addition to kind of locating these discourses on ageism, trying to understand what is affecting what may be at play in the data we collect from our research. We could also work at that social and organizational level. And here we could continually challenge age bias. So this is work that, of course, we could do on a micro level on our own, but we could also do this relationally. So one example where we do this is in classes with students. So with Galena Reeds at University of Maryland, we are offering a number of opportunities for students in different classes, particularly user-centered design classes. And of course, I teach on designing technology with older people, where we are bringing in sometimes end users, sometimes older people, including older people with dementia. Again, that's I have a special interest in that area. But then also community organizations like Galena works with Empowering the Ages organization. We've worked with Commissioners on Aging, so kind of local civic organizations that work with local government. And we integrate these groups and individuals into our class so that students have the opportunity to counter their stereotypes about older people. And I think that the learning goes both ways as well. So having opportunities to work in intergenerational groups, having the opportunity to work with populations where you may have heard about or only had very close, emotionally intense familial encounters with, for example, people with dementia, opportunities to encounter in a different setting. Another thing we can do at the social level is refine our user-centered design methods, right? So that was research like the study I talked about before, where we're really trying to understand the nuances of how people are participating with these methods that have been designed and used mostly for younger people, right? And understanding what in there is different and attending to those nuances really, and thinking about how we can change our design practices to account for that. And then finally, at that macro level, there's a couple things that I think we can do. One is balancing our focus on the interventions we bring in. So the study I talked about earlier with the alarm pendant hanging on the wall, that author talks a lot about how bringing in a new technology requires substantial amount of work on the other end, because older people, just all people, have their routines and their ways of living, right? So bringing this amazing new technology, maybe it does something really good, but it also requires shifting your routines around. The example I always think about is the most amazing smart, watch detector thing, but you have to plug it in every night. And if you forget, then you're not using it. So you have to develop a routine to remember to plug something in at the same time. So thinking about, so balancing when we're introducing shiny new technology, having that discretion when we introduce it. And one approach here that I think is really interesting is doing innovation on the other side. So Robin Brewer at University of Michigan has a really nice body of research where she has done the innovation on a platform, but older people can call in using their phones. So she worked, I believe, with low vision users and groups. So people who may not be as comfortable with certain forms of technology are able to use the phone to blog and have a blogging community and express themselves. So innovating on the platform side, but people can use the interfaces that they're familiar and comfortable with, rather than being introduced a new app that's going to update that you have to learn, for example. And I'll just conclude with an exercise that I like to do, and I like to have students in my classes do sometimes, when people are talking a lot about reflecting on, for example, their own older parents and how they want to keep them safe and what technologies might do that, is to think about how it might feel to be seen as in urgent need of monitoring and fixing, because we all have our own habits, I think, that we can imagine might not hold up to a public health or clinical scrutiny, right? But what it's like to have so much sustained medical and research attention, to have our presence and our activities framed as an international crisis, as aging often is. So scholars have noted there's a limit to how far empathy can take us, but I think this exercise can be really useful to locate places to intervene beyond the individual, and also to help us reframe our language, our focus, and the way we incorporate autonomy in design. With that, I'll thank you all for listening, and I'm excited if people have any questions they'd like to discuss.
So Amanda, I am looking at the Q&A, and we'll keep it open for a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, you can type them into that space. I'm happy to read them out loud for Amanda. Oh. Okay, Amanda, at what age did you start saying someone is old? Is it 50 or 65 or another age?
Yeah, so, okay, this question is a tricky one, right? Because recently I attended a workshop where much of the discussion was saying, should we even use the term older adults if it triggers so much stereotyping and ageism? So I would say so I think when ageism starts is one question, but when I recruit a group that I refer to as older adults, I use the definition of 65 plus, because that is the standard one that most US researchers use. But I also acknowledge that someone shared with me some research about what age people say older age is, and younger people people who are 20 may say 50. People who are 50 may say, decades ahead, and everyone is always saying older than them of when older age begins. So I think it is a tricky topic, as simple as the question is.
So basically, we all like to say old age is older than we are. Okay, the next question. It is kind of ironic that the National Institute on Aging is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and ageism is worse than when the amazing Dr. Robert Butler defined it. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question. And Amanda, do you have some evaluation tests at home for older adults on balance? We want to know where we are and how we have improved after exercise.
Interesting. So this is not an area that I know well, but maybe other people in the audience may have good resources for that.
Actually, I can jump in with, I'm the research program manager for the Johns Hopkins AITC and Wicker, and we actually funded a project in the first year of our grant cycle called the Balance T device. And it is a piece of exercise equipment that people use at home to improve their core strength. And it's definitely tested to show that balance has improved after people use that. It sounds like what this attendee is asking is for an evaluation test, but I just wanted to mention that there are devices that improve balance as well. And I'm looking to see if there are any more questions. Here we go. Often it is after a major problem is identified, probably by caregiver, maybe an older person, how to design intervention more appealing or encouraged to use before needed. So already a routine before really or greatly needed. So this is from Jane Gay. I'm not sure exactly what the question is there. I think that's more of a statement as well. And then Jennifer is asking, are there any pointers you'd recommend for getting older adults, including those living with dementia, excited about co-designing tech for older adults like them?
Yeah. So this is a kind of ongoing journey we've had because we've had a lot of success getting older adults in the area who we end up finding out are retired professors to participate in our research. And we learn a lot from that. That's great. But we've been making concerted efforts to, of course, expand beyond that, right? Because we want to get more represented groups. So really, it seems like building you could work with someone who already knows people well, right? And for example, we worked with someone who conducted exercise groups with different groups of older people, including people with cognitive concerns, which is the group we were trying to recruit at the time, which was really challenging. So working with someone who's kind of built up that trust and is able to also help you design your recruitment materials so they're not inadvertently stigmatizing and iterating on your recruitment materials, right? Because they could be signaling something. But someone she was able to sign people up directly, right? So, or you and your research group can also become that trusted partner. So I'm answering from the researcher side. I'm not sure if that's where the question is coming from, but so we've been working, for example, offering tech classes through organizations in our area. And the people we work with in those seem, have connected with the students leading the tech classes and seem really excited and eager to contribute. It's possible that that's because they just appreciate it and want to, pay back, but it's also possible because they can kind of understand what we're doing and how it might help them. So I think that's a big thing too, is the framing of what you're doing and how it might help, which is something sometimes you can't find out until you're in dialogue with the people you're trying to recruit. But then also the messaging you give about the study, and then also the way you're reaching people.
Thank you. The next question is, how could we help people having very poor eyesight to do exercise?
I think I'll turn this over to you, Anne, since you may also know of some new exciting technologies in this space.
Thank you. Actually, we are doing some work here at Hopkins, not only on vision tracking, but also obviously on fall avoidance and balance improvement. And a lot of these kinds of testing or exercises are done with a caregiver or with a physical therapist. We're also looking at how eyesight is linked to cognitive decline. These are excellent questions and excellent kind of inspirations for further tech development. I mentioned to Amanda before the webinar began, but that usually our audience for these webinars includes not only researchers, but also the stakeholders who eventually use the developed products that our researchers are creating. So I appreciate these questions, which are hopefully inspiring some of the researchers in attendance today to propose additional developments. The next question, I might have missed where you chose your research participants. Was it Maryland only? The state of Maryland is quite diverse. Were your participants non-diverse? Immigrant populations might be different adopters of tech, given their need to use tech, including smartphones, to stay in touch with their homelands, etc. Any thoughts on diversity, multicultural aspects of your excellent research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yes, so for some of our work, we really need to do in-person things. So those are in Maryland. When we've done work with people with dementia, that's been a population that's very challenging to recruit, especially as a non-kind of clinical researcher, right? Where I'm not a doctor seeing patients and able to kind of funnel them in, or not funnel, invite them to be in my studies. So in those studies, we often expand people from many different states, work with people online. So in Maryland, so right, so initially a lot our participants had been, I think, largely white, largely higher socioeconomic status, largely very educated. So that's those these amazing retired professors coming to our lab and saying, "Hey, would you like to work with our community?" And we've had, yeah, some great research experiences with them. But we've reflected on this and expanded to work with more representative groups, people who represent the diversity of the state. So for that, we've been going to these more community settings, like I mentioned, with the tech support thing. So this could be nearby churches we've been doing, or kind of programs that are between community organizations for particular minority group, for example, and kind of expanding there. So that's been good. And then in terms of the diversity or multicultural aspects more deeply beyond kind of expanding who we're talking to, there are researchers who've done incredible work with older adults from this perspective. So for example, Jean Chung, who was at Virginia Commonwealth University, has done research on Korean older adults. I think immigrants, like you mentioned, immigrant populations, right? So she's looked at specific things there in health informatics and nursing. And then Christina Harrington, Aisha Martin Hammond in my field, human computer interaction, have done research on African American and Black older adults and how they their experiences and needs for accessing health information, for example, and also how to tailor user-centered design studies to them. Case of Christina Harrington. So there are people doing really exciting work on this space, in this space.
Thank you. The next question is, how could we encourage people with vertigo to start exercise? Psychology barrier and physiological barrier.
I think this is another question for you, Anne.
And again, I don't have an answer, unfortunately. A lot of our research here at Johns Hopkins on the AITC is between engineers and geriatricians who are working collaboratively to develop products with tech and AI for older adults to age in a more healthy way. Those of you who are asking these excellent questions, I would also encourage you to visit our website to see some of the projects we've already funded. We just collected 95 applications for the 4th cycle of our grant, and so we're in the process of reviewing those, and hopefully some of the applications we advance will address some of these questions that you're posing. Amanda, do you have some exercise guidebook for dementia patients and families to do at home together?
So for this one, so I can talk about some options. I haven't studied if these are effective, but I do know that there are materials online, like YouTube videos, which are easily accessible, that include, if we're talking about someone with mobility constraints, like chair exercises. And I have seen people use these in group settings, like memory care units. And it's helpful to have someone, up there with a TV showing someone also how to do the motions. But that could be nice. And then also, if there is a possibility of accessing an occupational therapist, or a physical therapist, there are some occupational and physical therapists who have incredibly deep understanding of how to work with people with dementia. Really, really good at kind of facilitating people to do things that you may not have thought they could do because they really understand kind of how to communicate and how to guide people in a way that's most appropriate using the avenues that are most accessible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a request to send a copy of this presentation, and I just want everyone to know that this will be posted on our Johns Hopkins AITC website in the next 2 weeks, so everyone will have access to the presentation. And one more question, Amanda, a wish list question. If you were given millions of dollars in unlimited staff resources and time, what is a project you would love to undertake as a researcher?
Yeah, I like this question. Well, I think one of the, there's a lot, but one of the biggest issues that I have seen with technologies is that with some older people describing their issues is that it keeps changing, right? You get an update and everything is rearranged. With one colleague, we described this as like, you're used to opening your door, but then the lock moves, right? But then also the key doesn't work anymore. So we're taking these ways that people get used to technology with their motor memory, with their, all these kinds of subtle kind of like routine habit embodied experiences. And then all of a sudden everything's changing and you have to relearn. Or it doesn't work because you don't have an updated device. And maybe, I have access to an entire IT department right now, but sometimes if you, when you retire, you may not have that. So these everyday technologies become inaccessible. So I think really examining that question of, because I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if we want to stabilize some kind of interface and make it so the updates happen on the back end and don't make it through. Some of this stuff is physical too, right? If something needs to be outlets, people don't always write about this in their papers, but if you talk to a researcher about outlet location, that makes a huge impact on, where you can put things and how people use them and whether they even want them in their homes. So I think kind of examining that question and testing out different things we could do about it would be pretty impactful.
That's always a great question to get. I believe that's the last question. We had lots of praise for your presentation in the Q&A as well. And I just want to thank you myself for sharing your wisdom with us today. This is the second time that I've heard you speak, and it's, it's always a wonderful experience to learn from your wealth of knowledge about this area. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I see one more question. I could just type the answer in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you again. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Again, this will appear on our Johns Hopkins AITC website within the next couple of weeks. Take care.